May 7, 1945, 2:41 a.m. A schoolhouse in Reims, France. The room smells of cigarette smoke and damp plaster. Rain taps against the blacked-out windows in irregular rhythms, the only sound beyond the shuffling of papers and the occasional cough from the assembled officers. The schoolhouse, requisitioned months earlier to serve as Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, has seen countless briefings, operational orders, logistical conferences. But tonight is different. Tonight, the war ends. General Oberst Alfred Jodl sits at a plain wooden table, his Wehrmacht uniform still immaculate despite the collapse of everything it represents. His face is gray, drawn, the face of a man who has not slept properly in weeks. Beside him sits General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, after Dönitz succeeded Hitler. Their hands rest on the table, steady despite everything, a final performance of military discipline in the face of absolute defeat. Before them lies a document, 9 pages of legal text in English, French, Russian, and German, detailing the terms of unconditional surrender. The Allied officers arrayed on the other side of the table are a study in contrasts: American, British, French, Soviet, a coalition that mirrors the multinational character of the force that has crushed the Wehrmacht across 2 continents. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, sits at the center, pen ready, expression neutral. The formality of the moment cannot entirely conceal the exhaustion that marks every face in the room. 5 years and 8 months of war in Europe are about to conclude, not with a grand ceremony, but with signatures on paper in a converted schoolhouse classroom at nearly 3 a.m. But General Dwight David Eisenhower is not in the room. The Supreme Commander, the man who has led the largest military coalition in history, who has commanded millions of soldiers across the liberation of Western Europe, waits in his office down the hall. This is deliberate. Eisenhower has refused to meet with the German delegation, has declined to shake their hands or acknowledge them as military equals deserving of ceremonial courtesy. His absence is a message in itself, one that Jodl and von Friedeberg understand perfectly. They represent a regime that has forfeited its right to honor, a military force that has lost its claim to respect. They will sign the surrender, and then they will receive Eisenhower's final statement, and in that statement they will hear not the voice of a fellow soldier, but the voice of history rendering its judgment. Jodl signs first, his signature precise despite the tremor in his hand. Von Friedeberg follows. The Allied representatives add their signatures in sequence. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, the European war officially ends. The room remains silent. No celebration, no relief visible on any face. There is still the formality to complete, the message to be delivered. An aide is sent to summon the German delegation to Eisenhower's office. They walk down the narrow corridor. These officers who once commanded armies, who once believed their Wehrmacht was invincible, who once stood in this same France as conquerors 5 years earlier. Now they walk as supplicants, about to receive not terms for negotiation but notification of their absolute defeat. The door opens. Eisenhower stands behind his desk, not sitting, making no gesture of welcome. His face is set, not with triumph but with something harder, colder. He looks at the German officers, and when he speaks, his voice carries a weight that makes even these hardened military professionals visibly react. What Eisenhower says in this moment, what message he delivers to the representatives of the defeated Wehrmacht, will echo far beyond this room, will be remembered by every officer present for the rest of their lives. But to understand why his words carry such devastating power, why German officers who have endured years of brutal combat and catastrophic defeat will later describe this moment as among the most terrible of their lives, we must first understand what they expected from this war, what they believed about their enemies, and how the reality they encountered destroyed not just their armies, but their entire conception of warfare, honor and civilization itself. The confidence of conquerors and the June 1940, German officers had stood in this same France as victors. The Wehrmacht had accomplished what Imperial Germany had failed to achieve in 4 years of grinding attrition during the First World War. It had defeated France in 6 weeks. The campaign had been a masterpiece of operational art, combining armor, air power, and motorized infantry in a blitzkrieg that shattered Allied defenses and sent the British Expeditionary Force fleeing across the Channel at Dunkirk. German generals who had executed this victory believed they had validated a new form of warfare, proven the superiority of German military thought and organization. The officer corps of the Wehrmacht in 1940 represented a unique military culture, one that traced its lineage back through the Prussian military tradition to Frederick the Great. They prided themselves on their professional competence, their operational flexibility, their willingness to delegate authority to subordinate commanders. Unlike the rigid French military with its centralized command structure, or the British with their aristocratic officer class, the German officer corps saw itself as a meritocracy, where talent and audacity were rewarded regardless of social origin. They had studied warfare as a science, had refined their doctrine through rigorous analysis of their failures in the First World War, and by 1940 they believed they had achieved a synthesis of technology, tactics, and operational art that made them unbeatable. This confidence was not entirely unjustified. Between September 1939 and June 1941, the Wehrmacht had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. It had pushed the British from continental Europe, had threatened Cairo, had stood poised to seize Moscow. The string of victories seemed to validate everything the officer corps believed about themselves, about their system, about the superiority of German military culture. They were not, they insisted, fighting for the crude ideological goals of the Nazi Party. Many officers maintained a careful distance from National Socialism, but for Germany, for national greatness, for the restoration of their nation after the humiliations of Versailles. When America entered the war in December 1941, the German officer corps was not particularly concerned. America was an industrial power, certainly, but it was not a military power. It had no tradition of continental warfare. Its army was tiny, its officer corps inexperienced. The Americans would need years to mobilize, to train, to deploy, and by then German officers believed the war would be over. The Soviet Union would be defeated, Britain would negotiate peace, and America's late entry would be as irrelevant as it had almost been in the First World War. This contempt for American military capability was deeply rooted. German officers remembered that American intervention in 1917-1918 had come late, that American forces had been small and had fought under French command, that the war had been won primarily by French and British armies, with American industry providing material support. They looked at American society, its individualism, its lack of military tradition, its democratic messiness, and concluded that such a nation could never produce a military force capable of matching the Wehrmacht's professional excellence. Americans were good at manufacturing automobiles and refrigerators, perhaps, but warfare required discipline, sacrifice, martial culture, qualities that democracy inevitably corroded. Even as American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942, German officers maintained their confidence. The American performance at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where an Afrika Korps force under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim inflicted a humiliating defeat on American troops, seemed to confirm their assumptions. The Americans had more equipment, more supplies, more of everything, but they lacked the tactical sophistication and combat experience to use their advantages effectively. German officers concluded that the Americans would eventually prevail through sheer weight of numbers and materiel, but that they would never fight with the skill and courage of the Wehrmacht. This narrative comforted them through the defeats that followed: North Africa, Sicily, Italy. These were peripheral theaters, they told themselves, sideshows where Germany had never committed its full strength. The real test would come when the Americans and British attempted to cross the Channel, to land in France and face the full might of the Wehrmacht on ground it had fortified and prepared. That would be the decisive battle, and German officers believed they would win it. They would throw the Allies back into the sea, would inflict casualties so severe that America would lose its stomach for European war, would force a negotiated peace that would leave Germany still standing, still dangerous, still capable of another triad hegemony a generation hence. The reality of Normandy, June 6, 1944. The invasion came, and it did not go as German officers had expected. The massive deception operation, Fortitude, had convinced German high command that the main landing would be at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. Forces that might have crushed the Normandy beachheads were held in reserve hundreds of kilometers away, waiting for an invasion that never came. The Atlantic Wall, that supposedly impregnable line of fortifications that Germany had spent years constructing, was breached in hours. American and British forces poured ashore in numbers that stunned the German defenders, 176,000 troops on the first day alone, supported by 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. But numbers, German officers insisted, were not everything. The Americans and British had achieved surprise, had landed in overwhelming force, but they were ashore on a narrow front, constrained by the bocage countryside of Normandy, with its small fields and thick hedgerows. This was perfect defensive terrain, and the Wehrmacht had proven in Italy that it could exact terrible costs from attacking Allied forces even when outnumbered. The battle would be won through tactical excellence, through the superior training and combat experience of German soldiers, through the operational skill of German commanders, and for a few weeks this seemed true. The American advance inland was painfully slow. Each hedgerow became a miniature fortress, each field a killing ground. American casualties mounted, some German officers, surveying the carnage inflicted on American units trying to break out from the beachhead, allowed themselves to hope that perhaps the invasion could still be defeated, or at least stalemated long enough to force negotiations. Then the American industrial system made itself felt. The flow of supplies across the beaches was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever seen. American engineers constructed artificial harbors, the Mulberry Harbors, in a matter of days, creating port facilities that could handle thousands of tons of cargo. American logistics units landed enough fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies to keep a multi-army force operating at full intensity without pause. When equipment broke, it was repaired or replaced immediately. When units took casualties, replacements arrived within days. German forces, by contrast, were slowly being strangled. Allied air superiority was absolute. The Luftwaffe was almost entirely absent from the Normandy battlefield, having been ground down in the air war over Germany. Every road, every rail line, every bridge within 100 kilometers of the front was under constant air attack. German units could move only at night, and even then with heavy losses. Supplies trickled forward in dribs and drabs. Fuel became critically scarce. Ammunition was rationed. The Wehrmacht in Normandy was fighting brilliantly with the resources it had, but those resources were being systematically depleted while American strength grew daily. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began. After weeks of grinding attrition, American forces broke through German lines at St. Lo. The breakout that followed shattered the defensive front. American armored divisions poured through the gap, exploiting with a speed and operational daring that shocked German commanders. This was not supposed to be possible. American forces were supposed to be plodding, predictable, tactically rigid. Instead, they were executing an exploitation operation with the kind of tempo that German officers had believed only the Wehrmacht could achieve. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, wrote in his diary, "The Americans are not fighting as we expected. They learn too quickly. Their equipment is excellent. Their coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and aircraft is better than ours, and they have so much of everything that our tactical superiority cannot overcome their material advantage." The systematic destruction. What followed Operation Cobra was not just a military defeat, but a systematic destruction of the Wehrmacht in the West. The Falaise Pocket, where German forces attempted to retreat through a closing Allied encirclement, became a killing ground. Allied aircraft struck German columns continuously, turning roads into graveyards of burned-out vehicles and dead horses. When German forces finally escaped the pocket, they left behind 50,000 dead and 200,000 captured. The equipment losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns, thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, weapons of all types simply abandoned for lack of fuel or because their crews were dead or had fled. The retreat across France became a rout. Cities that had taken the Wehrmacht weeks to capture in 1940 fell to the Allies in days or hours. Paris was liberated in August. By September, American forces had reached the German border, had crossed the Rhine in some sectors, had penetrated the Siegfried Line. The entire conquest of 1940, everything the Wehrmacht had achieved in its moment of triumph, had been reversed in 3 months. German officers who survived this campaign emerged traumatized not just by the defeat, but by the nature of the defeat. They had been outfought, not just overwhelmed by numbers, though the numbers were indeed overwhelming, but outfought, tactically, operationally, strategically. American commanders had shown themselves capable of bold operational maneuvers. American soldiers had fought with a skill and aggressiveness that belied their supposed lack of military culture. American logistics had sustained operations at a tempo that German forces, even at the height of their power, had never maintained. And American firepower, the massed artillery, the ubiquitous air support, the seemingly endless ammunition, had created a battlefield environment where German tactical excellence could not compensate for material inferiority. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, later described the experience. The Americans fought a completely different war than we did. We tried to win through maneuver and tactical skill, through the courage and training of our soldiers. They won through system and organization, through the application of overwhelming power at the decisive point. Every time we established a defensive line, they would mass artillery, hundreds of guns, and simply obliterate our positions. Then their infantry and tanks would advance behind a wall of fire that made resistance nearly impossible. And when we counterattacked, their aircraft would appear within minutes and destroy our formations before they could even engage. We were not defeated by better soldiers. We were defeated by a better system. This was the realization that broke the confidence of the German officer corps. Not that they had lost, but how they had lost. It was one thing to be defeated by superior numbers, to go down fighting against overwhelming odds. There was honor in that, tragedy perhaps, but honor. It was something else entirely to be systematically dismantled by an enemy who fought not with passion or ideology, but with methodical, mechanical efficiency. The Americans were not avenging angels or ideological fanatics. They were professionals doing a job, and they were doing it better than the Wehrmacht could. The voice of judgment. Back in that schoolhouse office in Reims, Generaloberst Jodl and Admiral von Friedeburg stand before Eisenhower's desk. The Supreme Commander has kept them waiting several seconds in silence, a calculated pause that makes the German officers shift uncomfortably. When Eisenhower finally speaks, his words are clipped cold, delivered without ceremony. Do you understand the terms of the surrender document you have just signed? The question is asked in English, translated into German by an interpreter. Jodl answers that yes, they understand. The surrender is unconditional. All German armed forces will cease combat operations at 11:01 p.m. on May 8, 1945. All units will remain in place. All equipment will be surrendered intact. There will be no negotiations, no conditions, no armistice in the traditional sense, only complete submission to Allied authority. Eisenhower nods curtly. Then he begins to speak and his tone changes, becomes harder, laden with an anger he has kept carefully controlled throughout years of coalition command. He speaks of the concentration camps that Allied forces have been liberating as they advanced into Germany. He speaks of Dachau and Buchenwald, of Bergen-Belsen and Mauthausen. He speaks of what American soldiers found there, the gas chambers and the crematoria, the mass graves and the skeletal survivors, the systematic industrialization of murder. He speaks of the millions killed in these camps, Jews and Slavs and political prisoners and Roma and homosexuals and anyone else the Nazi regime had deemed unworthy of life. The German armed forces, Eisenhower says, his voice tight with controlled fury, have fought for a regime that has committed crimes beyond any justification of military necessity, beyond any precedent in modern warfare. You may claim you did not know. You may claim you were simply soldiers following orders. But you enabled this. The victories you won, the territories you conquered, the populations you subdued, all of this created the conditions for the greatest crimes in human history. The interpreter translates haltingly, struggling to convey not just Eisenhower's words but his tone, his obvious moral outrage. Jodl's face remains impassive but his hands clench slightly. Von Friedeburg stares at the floor. Eisenhower continues. He speaks of the rules of war, of the Geneva Conventions that the Wehrmacht had systematically violated in the East, of prisoners shot and civilians murdered and cities destroyed without military justification. He speaks of the responsibilities of military officers, of the professional obligations that transcend orders and regime loyalty. He tells them that their claims to military honor, to professional conduct, to standing as soldiers rather than criminals, have been forfeit by the nature of the regime they served and the atrocities that regime committed. The German officer corps, Eisenhower says, has proven itself either complicit or cowardly. Complicit if you knew what was being done and did nothing. Cowardly if you chose not to know. If you turned away from crimes committed in your name and with your support. Either way, you bear responsibility. You do not have the right to surrender with honor, because you have no honor remaining to surrender with. This is the message that makes the German officers tremble, not the terms of surrender, those were expected, inevitable, but this denial of their most fundamental identity, this stripping away of the professional self-image they had maintained even through defeat. They had told themselves they were soldiers, that they had fought cleanly, that whatever crimes the regime committed were not their concern or responsibility. Eisenhower was telling them this distinction was false, that there was no separating the Wehrmacht from the regime it served, that the uniform they wore was stained beyond redemption. Lieutenant K. Summersby, Eisenhower's driver and personal secretary, was present in the outer office and later recorded the scene. The Supreme Commander spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. His words were harsh, unforgiving. The German general stood rigidly at attention, but I could see them react physically to what he was saying. Their faces went pale. One of them, I think it was Jodl, was visibly shaking by the end. When the general dismissed them, they saluted mechanically and left without a word. The interpreter told me later that he had never seen such a devastating dressing down in his career. It was not just a criticism of their conduct, but an annihilation of their entire sense of themselves as honorable military professionals. The sound of Truth Eisenhower's voice, measured and relentless, became in that moment a symbol, not of American triumphalism or Allied victory, but of moral clarity cutting through the self-deceptions and rationalizations that the Wehrmacht had wrapped around itself. His voice represented the judgment of history, the settling of accounts, the moment when denial becomes impossible. Throughout the war, German officers had maintained careful distinctions. They were not Nazis, they insisted. They served Germany, not the party. The atrocities committed in the occupied territories were the work of the SS, of Himmler's organizations, not the professional military. The Wehrmacht fought a clean war, adhered to military codes, maintained its honor even in defeat. These distinctions had allowed German officers to fight on even as their nation committed unprecedented crimes, to maintain their self-respect even as they enabled a genocidal regime. Eisenhower's voice, in that schoolhouse office, destroyed these comfortable fictions. The Wehrmacht had been integral to the Nazi project. It had conquered the territories where the death camps operated. It had provided security for killing operations. It had collaborated with SS units in anti-partisan operations that murdered civilians. It had implemented the Commissar Order and the Barbarossa Decree, directives that explicitly ordered the murder of Soviet political officers and abandoned the rules of war in the East. Individual soldiers and officers may have fought honorably, but the institution as a whole had been complicit in atrocity. The documentation was overwhelming. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, they captured Wehrmacht records that made clear the military's involvement in war crimes. Orders signed by field marshals and generals authorized reprisal killings of civilians, instructed subordinates to show no mercy to partisans and their suspected supporters, implemented starvation policies designed to kill millions of Soviet civilians. The illusion that the Wehrmacht had fought a conventional war, separate from the regime's ideological and genocidal goals, collapsed under the weight of evidence. And German officers knew this. They had known it throughout, even as they maintained their careful denials. Many had witnessed atrocities. Some had participated. Others had heard stories and chosen not to investigate. The knowledge had been there, suppressed, compartmentalized, but present. Eisenhower's words, delivered without rhetoric or exaggeration, simply stated what they had known and refused to acknowledge, that they bore responsibility, that their service had enabled horror, that defeat was not just military but moral. Jodl and von Friedeberg left that office and returned to the room where the other members of the German delegation waited. Those officers later reported that Jodl, normally composed and professional, was visibly shaken. He sat down heavily, lit a cigarette with trembling hands, and said simply, It is over. Not just the war, but everything. They will not allow us even the dignity of defeat. The reckoning beyond. Eisenhower's message to the German officers at Reims was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader Allied determination to ensure that this war ended differently than the last one. After World War I, the German military had been allowed to maintain the fiction that it had not been defeated in the field but had been betrayed by weakness on the home front. The infamous stab-in-the-back myth that poisoned Weimar democracy and laid the groundwork for Nazi ascendance. This time there would be no ambiguity. Germany had been defeated totally, unconditionally, its military forces crushed and its territory occupied. There would be no myth-making, no claims of betrayal, no foundation for future revisionism. In the months following the surrender, as the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable, Allied authorities made systematic efforts to confront German military personnel with what their regime had done. German prisoners of war were required to watch films documenting the concentration camps. German civilians living near the camps were forced to tour them, to see the bodies in the crematoria and the evidence of systematic murder. Officers who claimed ignorance were presented with documents showing Wehrmacht complicity. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, prosecuted not just Nazi party officials but military commanders. The trials established in international law that following orders was not a defense for war crimes, that officers had responsibilities that transcended their oath to the state, that there were moral limits that no military discipline could override. German officers who had believed their service was honorable found themselves defendants in criminal proceedings, their orders and actions examined and judged by standards they had claimed not to recognize. For many German officers, this process was as traumatic as the military defeat itself. They had defined themselves by their profession, by their adherence to military codes, by their service to their nation. To be told that this service had been not heroic but criminal, not honorable but shameful, required a complete reconstruction of identity. Some refused to accept it, clung to their old narratives until death. Others underwent genuine transformations, came to acknowledge their complicity, spent their remaining years trying to warn future generations about the dangers of placing loyalty to state above moral law. Werner von Fritsch, a former Wehrmacht general who survived the war and lived into the 1960s, wrote in a private letter, "At Reims, when we signed the surrender and heard Eisenhower's words, I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Everything I had believed about myself, about my service, about the honor of the German officer, all of it was revealed as illusion. We had told ourselves we were soldiers, not criminals. We had maintained our codes and our rituals and our sense of professional dignity, even as the regime we served committed atrocities." Eisenhower made clear that this distinction was meaningless, that we had no right to claim honor when we had enabled horror. He was correct, and that correctness was more devastating than any military defeat. The voice as symbol. Eisenhower's voice in that Reims schoolhouse carried a weight far beyond the words themselves. It represented the voice of democracy confronting totalitarianism, not with ideological fervor but with moral clarity. Eisenhower was not a political figure. He was a professional soldier who had spent his career studying military science, not political philosophy. But he understood in a way that the German officer corps had failed to understand that military service existed within a moral framework, that there were some orders that could not be obeyed, some regimes that could not be served without forfeiting honor. This was the fundamental divide that the war had exposed. The German military tradition, with its emphasis on discipline and obedience, had proven incapable of resisting the Nazi regime's criminality. German officers had convinced themselves that their duty was to obey, to serve the state regardless of what that state did, to maintain their professional standards while turning away from the moral implications of their service. The Western democratic tradition, for all its flaws and inconsistencies, maintained that some principles transcended orders, that individuals bore moral responsibility for their actions regardless of institutional pressure. Eisenhower's voice, measured and unforgiving, articulated this truth in a way that the German officers could not ignore or rationalize away. He spoke not as a victor gloating over the defeated, but as a military professional rendering judgment on colleagues who had failed their most fundamental obligations. The trembling that observers noted in the German officers was not fear of personal consequences. They already knew they faced imprisonment, possibly execution, but recognition that they had been weighed and found wanting, that their entire conception of military honor had been exposed as corrupt. This voice, this moment of judgment echoed through the post-war reconstruction of Germany. When the Federal Republic was established in 1949 and began rebuilding its military forces, the new Bundeswehr was constructed on principles explicitly designed to prevent a repetition of the Wehrmacht's failures. German soldiers were taught that they were citizens in uniform, that they had a responsibility to disobey illegal orders, that obedience had moral limits. The concept of innere Führung, inner leadership, emphasized that soldiers were moral agents, not mere instruments of the state. This represented a complete break with the Prussian military tradition that had produced the Wehrmacht's catastrophic moral failures. The American system. What made Eisenhower's message so devastating to the German officers was not just its moral content, but what it revealed about the society that had defeated them. The Wehrmacht had convinced itself that democracies were weak, that they lacked the discipline and unity of purpose necessary for sustained warfare, that their material advantages would be negated by their political and cultural deficiencies. Eisenhower, personally and symbolically, disproved all of this. Eisenhower was not an aristocrat or a product of a military caste. He was the son of a railway worker from Kansas, educated at West Point on merit, promoted through competence rather than connections. He represented the democratic ideal that talent and ability could rise regardless of birth. And he had commanded successfully the largest coalition military force in history, managing the egos and interests of multiple nations, coordinating operations across thousands of miles, sustaining combat operations at a scale and intensity that no previous military force had achieved. The American military system that Eisenhower embodied was not based on blind obedience but on initiative and flexibility. American officers were trained to think independently, to adapt to changing circumstances, to question orders if those orders seemed inconsistent with the situation. This was the opposite of the rigid hierarchy that characterized the Wehrmacht. And yet, paradoxically, the American system had proven more effective. American units adapted to challenges like the hedgerows of Normandy faster than German units. American commanders innovated and improvised while German commanders waited for orders from higher headquarters. The material abundance that sustained American military operations was not just a matter of industrial capacity but reflected a different approach to warfare. The American military did not ask its soldiers to die gloriously, but worked systematically to keep them alive and effective. Medical care was excellent. Wounded American soldiers had survival rates far higher than their German counterparts. Logistics ensured regular hot meals, mail from home, rotations out of combat for rest. This was not softness, but calculation. Soldiers who were well-fed, well-supplied, and confident they would be cared for if wounded fought more effectively than soldiers who were told to embrace sacrifice and death. German officers had mocked this concern for soldier welfare as evidence of American weakness. After the war, survivors recognized it as a source of strength. General Hermann Balck, who commanded German forces against American units in France, later wrote, "We thought the Americans were soft because they cared about their soldiers' comfort. We were wrong. A soldier who knows his nation values his life, who trusts that he will be supplied and supported and cared for if wounded, fights with confidence. Our soldiers fought bravely, but by 1944 they fought without hope. They knew they were expendable, that the regime cared nothing for their lives, that they would be sacrificed without hesitation if it served some ideological goal. This corroded morale in ways we did not recognize until too late. The weight of complicity, in the weeks following the surrender, as German officers were interrogated and debriefed, many attempted to distance themselves from the regime's crimes. They had not known about the death camps they claimed. They had not participated in atrocities. They had fought an honorable war even if the regime they served had committed dishonor. These claims became increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence accumulated. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted 24 major war criminals. But beyond these headline cases, there were thousands of subsequent proceedings against lower-ranking officers and officials. The evidence presented at these trials made clear that Wehrmacht involvement in war crimes had been extensive and systematic. Operations in the Soviet Union had deliberately targeted civilians, had implemented starvation policies, had cooperated with SS killing units. The siege of Leningrad, which killed more than 1 million civilians through starvation and bombardment, was a Wehrmacht operation. The mass shootings of Jews in the occupied Soviet territories were often carried out with Wehrmacht logistical support and sometimes direct participation. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, was executed at Nuremberg for war crimes. Before his execution, he stated, "I believed I was serving my country and obeying lawful orders. I was wrong. There are orders that cannot be obeyed, and I should have had the courage to refuse them. I did not, and the guilt of that failure will follow me to my grave." This acknowledgement, rare among senior Wehrmacht officers, represented the kind of moral reckoning that Eisenhower's words at Reims had demanded. The German military had failed not just strategically but morally. It had placed obedience above ethics, national loyalty above human decency, professional discipline above moral law, and this failure had enabled horrors that would stain German history for generations. The younger generation of German officers, those who had served as junior ranks during the war, struggled with this legacy. Some denied it, retreated into bitterness and claims of victimization. Others confronted it honestly, acknowledged their complicity even if their individual actions had been limited. Helmut Schmidt, who served as a Wehrmacht officer during the war and later became Chancellor of West Germany, spoke of the moral burden that his generation carried. "We served a criminal regime. Many of us did not recognize its full criminality at the time. Some of us participated in crimes. Others simply obeyed orders without questioning. All of us bear responsibility for what was done. The only way to honor those who died in that war is to ensure that such a thing never happens again, that German military force is never again placed in service of criminal goals." The epilogue of Voices: Eisenhower died in 1969, having served as Supreme Allied Commander, NATO Commander, Columbia University President, and two-term President of the United States. His post-war career represented the transition from military to civilian leadership that is central to democratic government, the general becoming citizen again, wielding power through elected office rather than military command. In his farewell address as president in 1961, Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, about the dangers of allowing military concerns to dominate civilian policy. It was a warning rooted in his wartime experience, in his understanding that military force must serve political goals, not dictate them. The German officers who heard his voice in that Reims schoolhouse took varied paths after the war. Some, like Alfred Jodl, were executed for war crimes. Jodl was hanged in 1946, his final words a profession of loyalty to Germany and a denial of criminal intent. Others served prison terms and were eventually released. A few cooperated with Allied authorities, providing intelligence about Soviet military capabilities during the early Cold War, their expertise valued even as their past remained condemned. The schoolhouse in Reims where the surrender was signed became a museum. Visitors can see the room where the document was signed, can stand where Eisenhower stood when he delivered his final message to the German officers. The museum presents the surrender not as a moment of triumph, but as a moment of reckoning, a point where moral accounts were settled and a new framework for international military conduct was established. The voice that spoke in that room, firm, clear, uncompromising, continues to echo in military education. At West Point and Sandhurst, at St. Cyr and the Bundeswehr academies, officer candidates study the moral dimensions of military service, learn about the responsibilities that transcend orders, understand that professional competence without moral clarity is not sufficient. The lessons of the Wehrmacht's failure are taught explicitly, that a military force can be tactically excellent and strategically competent and still serve evil, that officers have obligations beyond obedience, that some orders must be refused regardless of consequences. The testament of judgment. There is something profoundly American about Eisenhower's message at Reims, something that reveals the character of the democratic system that defeated totalitarianism. It was not a message of vengeance or hatred. It was not gloating or triumphalist. It was instead a clear statement of moral principles, an articulation of standards that the German officers had violated through their service to the Nazi regime. Eisenhower spoke as a professional to professionals, as a soldier to soldiers, and told them that they had failed the most basic tests of honorable military service. This capacity to render moral judgment while maintaining professional standards, to condemn actions without dehumanizing actors, to demand accountability while offering the possibility of redemption. These are hallmarks of democratic culture at its best. The Allies did not execute all German officers, did not pursue indiscriminate vengeance, did not reduce their defeated enemies to subhuman status as the Nazi regime had done to its victims. Instead, they established tribunals, presented evidence, allowed defendants to speak in their own defense, and then rendered judgments according to law. It was a demonstration that civilization could survive war, that moral principles could be maintained even in extremity, that justice was possible even for the most terrible crimes. The trembling that observers noted in the German officers at Reims was the trembling of men whose self-deceptions had been stripped away, whose carefully maintained illusions had been shattered by confrontation with truth. They had told themselves they were honorable soldiers serving their country. Eisenhower's voice told them they were something else, accomplices to atrocity, enablers of genocide, participants in crimes against humanity. And the devastating power of his message lay in its truth, undeniable and unavoidable. In the decades since that night in May 1945, military forces around the world have struggled with the lessons of the Wehrmacht's moral failure. How do you build military effectiveness while maintaining ethical standards? How do you demand obedience while preserving moral agency? How do you serve the state while recognizing that some state actions are criminal? These questions remain unresolved, debated in classrooms and training grounds, tested in conflicts where the distinction between lawful military action and war crime is not always clear. But the voice in that Reims schoolhouse established a standard, set a marker that cannot be ignored or forgotten. Military service, no matter how professional or competent, cannot redeem immoral purposes. Obedience to orders does not absolve responsibility for criminal actions. The uniform does not protect against judgment when the cause it serves is corrupt. These principles, articulated by Eisenhower and encoded in international law at Nuremberg, remain the foundation of modern military ethics, the sound of democracy. If we listen carefully to that moment in Reims, to Eisenhower's voice cutting through the rationalizations and denials of the defeated German officers, we hear not just the settling of one war's accounts, but the articulation of democracy's moral claim. The great ideological struggle of the 20th century was between systems that valued the individual and systems that subordinated individuals to collective purposes. The democratic West, for all its flaws and inconsistencies, maintained that individual moral agency mattered, that people bore responsibility for their choices, that no ideology or state interest could override fundamental human rights. The Wehrmacht had embodied the opposite principle. Individual conscience was subordinated to duty. Moral questions were deferred to higher authority. The soldier's obligation was to obey, to fight, to sacrifice without questioning the purposes for which he fought. This created military forces of tremendous combat effectiveness but moral emptiness. German soldiers fought brilliantly for a cause that was corrupt, served professionally a regime that was criminal, maintained their codes of honor while enabling dishonor. Eisenhower's voice at Reims said, "This is not enough. Professionalism without moral foundation is worthless. Obedience without conscience is dangerous. Service without ethical standards is participation in crime." These were not comfortable truths for the defeated German officers to hear, but they were necessary truths. Truths that needed stating so clearly and unambiguously that no evasion was possible. And in that clarity, in that moment of uncompromising moral judgment, we hear the voice of a system that had proven itself superior, not just in material terms but in its understanding of what military force should serve. Democracy, with all its messiness and argument and compromise, had defeated totalitarianism not just by producing more tanks and aircraft, but by fighting for something worth defending. For the principle that individuals matter, that human rights exist, that there are moral limits that no state may violate. The trembling of those German officers in that schoolhouse was the trembling of an old order confronting its own obsolescence, of a military tradition recognizing that it had been weighed in the balance and found catastrophically wanting. They had believed in discipline and duty and national greatness. They had discovered that these values without moral constraint led to horror, and they had been defeated not by barbarians or ideological fanatics, but by a democratic society that had mobilized its abundant resources in service of genuine moral principles. That voice, measured and relentless, speaking truth to power even when power was already defeated. That was the voice of democracy rendering judgment on totalitarianism, of civilization holding barbarism accountable, of the future confronting the past, and its echo, preserved in that schoolhouse museum, in the histories and memoirs, in the military academies where future officers learn the lessons of that war, continues to remind us that how we fight matters as much as whether we win, that the purposes we serve define us more than our professional competence. That moral clarity, when combined with material power and sustained effort, can prevail even against forces that seem, in the moment, overwhelming. German officers trembled when they heard Eisenhower's final message, because they recognized in that moment that they had not just lost a war, but had lost the larger argument about how human societies should be organized, what military forces should serve, and what obligations transcend national loyalty and professional duty. They had fought for might. Democracy had proven that right combined with might was stronger still. And that lesson, spoken in a quiet voice in a French schoolhouse in the exhausted hours after midnight, echoes yet.